opens in a tense courtroom where everything is about to change. You won't believe what happens next when a racist cop crosses paths with someone he never expected. Get ready for an intense, jaw-dropping moment in this explosive story. They say justice always prevails, but sometimes it takes the unexpected to truly expose the truth. Before the story continues, let us know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying this intense ride, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories. This intro keeps things suspenseful, while the courtroom was silent, save for the rustling of papers and the occasional cough from a nervous onlooker. The air was thick with tension as the trial of Officer Jack Collins, a cop accused of multiple racist incidents, entered its final stages. Today was supposed to be a day of resolution, justice for the victims of his actions, especially for those who had felt the sting of his prejudice. But something was about to change the course of this trial, something no one could have foreseen. At the front of the room, Judge Simone Blackwell sat, her eyes focused and unwavering. As the first black judge to serve in this district, she had fought her way through decades of discrimination, always maintaining her composure. Today she had the chance to show the world what true justice looked like. Collins, a man in his mid-40s, sat in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of arrogance and defiance. He had been a cop for over 15 years, his actions documented through various complaints of racism and brutality, but none had stuck until now. His trial was different. There was something more at stake, and everyone in the room knew it. The room buzzed with murmurs as the defense attorney, a slick man in his early 50s, made his closing argument. His voice was smooth, polished, but the content was anything but. He painted Officer Collins as a victim of bad circumstances, of poor judgment, and of course the perceived racial bias that plagued his career. As he spoke, Collins leaned forward, his eyes scanning the courtroom. His focus lingered on Judge Blackwell. His hands were twitching, nervous, or something more dangerous. No one could tell. The moment the defense attorney finished, the prosecutor stood up, her face stern, her voice unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice cutting through the tension. "This trial isn't just about one man's actions. It's about holding those in power accountable. Officer Collins has used his badge to discriminate, to harm, and to degrade innocent people. His actions are not isolated, and it's time we take a stand for the victims who can't be here today." Her words echoed in the room, and for a moment there was a sense of unity. The jury was focused, their eyes locked on her every word. But it wasn't the prosecutor's speech that would decide the fate of Officer Collins. It was the final moments of the trial, the dramatic shift that no one saw coming. As the prosecutor finished her statement and sat down, the courtroom fell silent once again. Judge Blackwell rose to deliver her instructions to the jury, her voice steady and commanding. But before she could speak, something shifted. Collins stood up, his face a twisted mask of rage. "Enough," he shouted, startling everyone in the room. His voice echoed through the courtroom, and his body was tense with fury. The room froze. The deputies at the door flinched, but no one moved. Collins' eyes locked onto Judge Blackwell as he stepped forward. His hand shot down to his waist, and in the blink of an eye, the cold metallic click of a gun being drawn shattered the stillness. Gasps filled the room. Judge Blackwell's expression remained calm, but her eyes widened slightly. The gun was now aimed directly at her, its barrel cold and threatening. The room was paralyzed with shock. The defense attorney backed away slowly, his face pale. The jury, silent and wide-eyed, didn't know what to do. "Do you really think you can bring me down like this?" Collins sneered. His voice was thick with hatred, and his finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. But what happened next was the last thing anyone expected. With a sharp motion, Judge Blackwell reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out a small device. It wasn't a weapon. No, it was far more powerful than that. She pressed a button, and the lights in the courtroom flickered. The heavy, oppressive silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching from outside the building. Collins froze, his hand still gripping the gun. His eyes darted around in confusion. He had no idea what was happening. The door to the courtroom burst open and a team of FBI agents stormed in, their badges gleaming in the light. The agents were swift and efficient. One moved toward the prosecutor, another toward the defense table. But it was the lead agent, a tall figure with a stern expression, who headed straight toward Collins. The agent locked eyes with him. "Put the weapon down, Officer Collins. You're under arrest for attempted assault and murder," the agent commanded. Collins, still shaking with fury, lowered his weapon. His face twisted in disbelief as he took in the presence of the agents. The reality of the situation hit him hard. This wasn't just a courtroom confrontation. It was about to become an official federal case, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The agents quickly surrounded Officer Collins, their hands steady but swift as they moved to subdue him. His defiance was evaporating, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching fear. The cold barrel of the gun now rested loosely in his trembling hands. His mind was racing, but all he could hear were the sharp, controlled orders from the lead agent. "Get down on your knees." Slowly, the agent instructed, his voice like ice, devoid of any emotion. For a moment Collins hesitated, but when he saw the cold eyes of the agents locking onto him, he dropped to his knees, his arms raised above his head. His shoulders slumped as the reality of his actions hit him. He had crossed a line that even his badge couldn't protect him from now. Judge Simone Blackwell stood tall at the bench, her gaze unwavering. She had been the target of his hatred, but now she wasn't just a victim of his bigotry, she was the one who had ensured his reckoning. Her calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. But she wasn't done yet. "Get him out of here," she called to the officers, her voice steady but commanding, "and make sure he's processed properly. No exceptions." As Collins was dragged from the courtroom, he shot a final venomous look at Judge Blackwell. His arrogance had dissipated, replaced by shame and regret. But that look told her everything she needed to know. He would not go down without a fight, even if he was about to face the full weight of the law. Judge Blackwell turned to face the courtroom. The tension was palpable, as if the entire room was holding its breath. She had been subjected to the most brazen form of discrimination, but in this moment she had risen above it, standing strong as an embodiment of justice. She looked out at the audience, then at the jury, and then at the media cameras flashing in the back. Everyone was watching her, watching for how she would respond, how she would carry the weight of the moment. Her voice broke the silence. "This is a victory, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever been treated unfairly, who has been prejudged by their appearance, their skin color, their gender. Today justice was served, but this is only the beginning. We must continue to fight against a system that allows hate and prejudice to persist." The reporters in the room jotted down her every word, and the jury members exchanged looks. They had witnessed something extraordinary, an unwavering figure in the face of racism, and the shattering of the illusion that some people were above the law, but the courtroom wasn't done yet. The room, which had held a simmering tension just moments ago, now buzzed with energy. Judge Blackwell's words had reignited a flame of hope, not just for the case at hand, but for something far bigger. This was a tipping point, a moment in history. Outside the courtroom, a wave of protesters had gathered. The message had spread quickly, the story of the black woman who had stood up against a racist officer and won. The media was already capturing the scene, broadcasting it to millions across the country. This was a symbol of the change that so many had fought for, and it was finally within reach. Alicia, the Army colonel, who had helped secure backup earlier, stood outside the courthouse, her arms folded as she watched the scene unfold. She knew that this moment wasn't just about one officer. It was about sending a message to every person in power who had ever thought they were untouchable. This was the moment the tide turned. But Alicia also knew this was just one victory in an ongoing battle. The police officer who had tried to assert dominance over a system he thought he controlled was gone, but the fight against the injustices he represented was far from over. The door of the courthouse slammed open, and the FBI agents who had escorted Collins away entered the press room. They had a message. The investigation had already begun. Official charges were being pressed, and the department would no longer be protecting officers like Collins. Alicia joined Judge Blackwell as she addressed the crowd. With the camera lights in their faces, it felt as though they were at the center of a massive storm. They had just played a role in a pivotal moment, but Alicia had seen enough to know this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. "This isn't just a case about one officer," Alicia said to the reporters, her voice resolute. "This is a case about accountability. This is a case about showing the world that when you abuse your position of power, there are consequences." The reporters clicked their cameras, hungry for every word, but Alicia wasn't finished. "And if anyone thinks they can get away with it, think again. This is just the beginning of a broader movement, one that will ensure every person, no matter their skin color or background, gets the justice they deserve." The room was silent as Alicia's words sunk in. The officers who had laughed earlier were no longer part of the narrative. They had been outwitted and outclassed by the very system they had tried to oppress, and the fallout had only just begun. The courtroom was silent as Judge Simone Blackwell prepared to announce her ruling. The once chaotic energy that filled the room had calmed down, now replaced with a heavy tension as all eyes turned toward the judge. Officer Collins sat at the defendant's table, his face twisted in frustration. He could feel the weight of the moment, but not the full scope of it. His arrogance had been replaced with fear, but it was too late for him. Behind Judge Blackwell, The jury members shifted uneasily in their seats, their eyes darting from Collins to the judge. They had heard the evidence, they had seen the video, but something about the atmosphere in the room suggested that this wasn't just another trial. This was something much more profound. Judge Blackwell rose from her chair, her face stern and resolute. The press was already preparing their cameras, ready to capture every second of what was about to unfold. It was not just a trial, it was a statement. It was her chance to show the world that as a black woman, she could wield the power of the justice system with strength and dignity. She cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the silence. "Officer Collins, you have been found guilty of racial profiling, use of excessive force, and a violation of the civil rights of the victim. Your actions were not those of a law enforcement officer, but of someone who abused their power. The sentence will be decided shortly, but let me be clear, this will not stand." Her words hung in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of the responsibility she had just taken on. The courtroom was still, everyone holding their breath. The gavel that would bring finality to the case had not yet been struck, but it was clear Collins would not escape justice. The media had gathered outside, waiting for this moment. News cameras, social media influencers, and journalists were all set to broadcast Judge Blackwell's statement to the world. The stakes were higher than ever, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like true justice might prevail. Inside the courtroom, Collins' attorney was frantically whispering something to him. Collins glanced at his defense attorney, but remained silent. His lawyer had done everything in his power to reduce the charges, but it had been clear from the start that Collins' actions had been indefensible. The evidence against him was irrefutable, and no amount of legal wrangling could change that. Judge Blackwell looked down at Collins. She could feel the weight of the decision she was about to make, not just for this case, but for everyone who had ever been wrongly targeted, wrongly abused, and wrongly silenced by the justice system. She was the symbol of a fight long overdue. She knew that, as a woman in a position of power, especially as a black woman, every move she made would be scrutinized. She couldn't afford to show weakness, to falter in this crucial moment. This was bigger than her. It was about the countless lives that had been ruined by the very people who were supposed to protect them. She would not fail them. The gavel came down with a resounding bang. "Officer Collins, you are hereby sentenced to prison for your crimes, effective immediately. You will be taken into custody and held pending further legal action." The room erupted in a mixture of gasps and subdued applause. For once, justice had been served. For once, an officer who had abused his position of power was facing the consequences of his actions. But even as the courtroom began to clear, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that this moment was just the beginning. This victory was a small piece of a much larger battle, a battle that would continue for as long as people like Judge Simone Blackwell had the strength to keep fighting. Outside, the protests had begun. People flooded the streets, chanting for justice, holding signs high in the air. They weren't just celebrating the conviction of one officer, they were celebrating the possibility that this could be the moment that sparked real change, that the systemic injustices that had plagued the country for generations could finally be exposed for what they were: unacceptable, unjust, and unsustainable. Judge Blackwell stood in the doorway of the courthouse, her hand resting on the handle as she watched the crowd gather. She knew they were watching her, but it wasn't her they were really celebrating. They were celebrating the victory over the system, over the force that had held them down for so long, and she could hear their voices calling her name as they marched, their chants reverberating in the streets. She had been their beacon of hope. But for Alicia, the fight wasn't over. She knew that this victory was only the first step in a long journey. The system was broken, but today they had proved that it could be fixed, and she would make sure that every officer who thought they were above the law was held accountable. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from General Maxwell. "We're not done yet. Let's keep this going." Alicia smiled to herself as she looked out at the crowd. The fight for justice had just begun, and she was ready to lead it. The days following the verdict had felt like an unrelenting tide of emotions, news coverage, and public outcry. Judge Simone Blackwell had expected the media frenzy, but the sheer magnitude of it still took her by surprise. News outlets, social media platforms, and activists rallied behind her, praising her courage for delivering the first major blow to a broken system. The fight was gaining momentum, but Alicia Graves knew that, despite the victory, the real battle had only just begun. In the days that followed, the police department's response was cautious but necessary. The internal investigation had begun, with a full review of the department's history of racial profiling, brutality, and misconduct. The FBI had been called in to ensure the investigation was thorough and unbiased. No one in the department had anticipated the explosive aftermath of this case. What was once a simmering issue had now boiled over into a firestorm of reform. Alicia, standing with Judge Blackwell at a press conference, couldn't help but notice the palpable energy in the air. The press was waiting to hear the next steps. Alicia had seen the hunger for change in the crowd. The call for justice wasn't just for one officer, it was for an entire system. "Judge Blackwell, what happens now?" a reporter called out. The cameras turned toward the judge as she adjusted her glasses and stood up from her seat at the press podium. Her demeanor was calm but commanding, just as it had been in the courtroom. She knew that this was her moment to shine, not for herself but for all those who had suffered at the hands of corrupt officials. "This isn't the end of this story. Today we stand here victorious, but there is still much work to be done. We cannot allow this incident to be treated as an isolated one. We must dismantle the systems that allow for the abuse of power to continue." The room was silent for a moment, as the weight of her words sank in. She paused, her voice gaining strength. This trial, this victory, was about accountability. But now, we will focus on transparency. We will focus on reform. We will ensure that those who abuse their positions are held accountable. No one, not even those who wear badges, are above the law. The room erupted in applause, reporters typing quickly to capture her every word. This wasn't just another press conference. It was a call to arms, a rallying cry for justice in a system that had long failed the most vulnerable. Alicia Graves stood at the back of the room, arms crossed and a small smile on her face. She knew this was just the beginning. Her role in this fight was far from over. The system had to change, and she wasn't going to stop until it did. Outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered once again, their chants of justice filling the streets. This wasn't just a protest, this was a movement. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds had come together to demand change. The momentum was undeniable. Alicia joined Judge Blackwell in a small office, away from the cameras and the media frenzy. The two women exchanged a look of quiet understanding. They had been fighting this battle for years, but now it felt different. The country was listening. Change was possible. "Alicia," Judge Blackwell began, her voice low but firm. "We can't afford to let this moment slip away. We need to keep pushing. Keep the pressure on." "I agree," Alicia replied, nodding. "This is bigger than us. We need to make sure we have the right people in positions of power to make real change." The days following the verdict were marked by action. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and federal investigations expanded beyond the police department. Activists, lawmakers, and community leaders met regularly to strategize, and Alicia found herself at the center of many of these discussions. "Alicia, you've been instrumental in pushing this forward. What's next?" a reporter asked her one afternoon as she left her office. Alicia paused, her mind racing. "We keep going. We work with the community, with local governments, and with the police departments themselves. There are systemic issues we have to address, and we won't stop until they're fixed." Her words were met with nods of agreement, but even as Alicia looked ahead, she couldn't shake the thought that Officer Collins' conviction was only one piece of the puzzle. The real challenge lay in changing the system that had allowed him to thrive. Meanwhile, Officer Collins was being processed in a holding facility, his future uncertain. The humiliation was sinking in, but for him, it wasn't just about the trial. He knew he was about to face the consequences of a life built on corruption, racism, and cruelty. The weight of his actions was finally catching up with him. There would be no escaping what was coming next. For him, the future was a blank slate, and the reality of his downfall began to sink in with every passing moment. Back in the courtroom, the tension was rising as the officers involved in the other incidents were scheduled for their own hearings. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but Alicia knew that this wouldn't be enough. There would be more work to do, more battles to fight. This was just the beginning. She stood in the courthouse hallway, staring at the busy scene unfolding around her. She was ready to do whatever it took to make sure this wasn't the last victory in the fight for justice. They had made history, but it wasn't enough. The day after Officer Collins' conviction was finalized, the ripple effects were felt all over the country. Judge Simone Blackwell's firm stance in the courtroom had set a precedent, but the fight was far from over. The protests that had once been a symbol of anger were now fueling a national movement, as more people across the country took to the streets, demanding the same kind of accountability from their law enforcement. The media coverage intensified, with nightly broadcasts covering every new development. Alicia Graves, standing next to Judge Blackwell, was receiving calls from senators, congresspeople, and even the president, all praising her efforts. But it wasn't the praise she sought. It was the lasting change she knew the country needed. She had fought for justice, but the real challenge lay in ensuring the momentum didn't fade. "Alicia," General Maxwell said as he met her outside the courthouse, the day after the verdict, His face was somber, but there was a hint of approval in his eyes. You've done something incredible here. We've all seen it, but now we need to take it further. Alicia nodded. I know, she replied, her gaze unwavering. This isn't over yet. The investigation into the other officers will continue, but the real work begins in the community and in the departments themselves. General Maxwell's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his face turning serious as he read the message. Federal oversight's being pushed for. He looked at Alicia, his eyes a little wider. This is what we've been waiting for. Real reform is finally on the table. Alicia's heart raced, but her expression remained calm. It's about time, she said, feeling a surge of hope. We need transparency and oversight from the very top. The system needs to be rebuilt. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a crowd gathering outside. Protesters had come together once again, but this time it wasn't just in anger. It was a demonstration of unity and purpose. The people were mobilized. Alicia turned toward the growing crowd. Their chants were a mixture of calls for justice and empowerment. They were fighting for something far beyond one case. This was about systemic change that would impact generations to come. This wasn't just a moment of victory, it was a movement in the making. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Officer Collins was in a holding cell, the reality of his situation sinking in. He had thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, that his badge would protect him from the law, but now, he was facing the full weight of the justice system. Sitting in the cold, dimly lit room, he couldn't escape the images of the courtroom, of Judge Blackwell delivering her judgment, of the FBI agents who had arrested him without mercy. He had always believed he was above the law, but now, that belief had crumbled. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing an unfamiliar number on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? The voice on the other end was low and serious. This is your last chance, Collins. The department's done with you. Your future's uncertain, but you can still cooperate. Do the right thing, and maybe you'll get some leniency. Collins stiffened, his pride unwilling to accept that this was his reality. I've done nothing wrong, he muttered under his breath. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had let his prejudice control him, and now it was too late. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. In the coming weeks, federal oversight over the police department was enforced, and the investigations into Officer Collins and the others involved in similar incidents became a national priority. The department was forced to undergo mandatory training on racial bias, and there were major reforms to policies regarding the use of force and how officers interacted with the public. Alicia Graves didn't let up. She continued to lead the charge, collaborating with local communities, activists, and lawmakers to ensure that the reforms weren't just words on paper but actions that brought tangible change. She knew it would take time, but with each passing day she saw more and more people rallying behind the cause. They weren't just fighting for one person, they were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or abused by a broken system. The story of Officer Collins's conviction became a landmark moment in American history. His conviction was not just about him, it was a statement. It was a reminder that no matter how much power someone held, they were still accountable to the law. And it wasn't just the officer who was being held responsible, it was an entire system that had failed for far too long. Judge Blackwell's words rang true. This ends today. We will not allow this to continue. As the sunset dipped behind the courthouse, casting long shadows over the city, Alicia walked slowly down the steps of the courthouse. She had done her part, but the fight wasn't over. She knew that as long as there was injustice, her work would continue. The movement was only beginning, and Alicia Graves was ready to lead it.